Okay, well, I guess we need to get them. All right, well, welcome. And I'm going to introduce Obie Shelburne and Scooter Cheatham, who are going to be presenting today. And I'm not going to take up much of your time because you'd rather hear them speak. But Obie is going to speak on a lost portion of the Emory Boundary Survey, the Chandler Survey, which is a very interesting solving of a mystery that he did. And Scooter Cheatham is going to speak on discovering the lost planet Underfoot that we all know but kind of forget about. So we'll start with Obie Shelburne.
Get my pointer out here. Good morning. Are we on out there? Great. Yeah. I'm just going to talk to the slides, and we'll go through about 5 of them, and there'll be time for questions, for joint questions after Scooter finishes with his presentation. This introductory slide here just shows the only picture in the Emory report, which is 3 volumes, 2,000 pages, that actually shows surveyors. And so I found it interesting. This survey camp's on the lower Rio Grande. To me, it was interesting because it gave me a tip of what instrument they were using right there. I can tell from the profile that it's a theodolite and not a standard kind of instrument that most surveyors use these days. On theodolite, it's so small you can't rotate it 180 degrees, but it's a lot lighter and easier to carry around. Anything below Del Rio to the coast. Next. Not working. Oh. Next. Let's go on, please. We're going directly to the treaty map here, which is the founding document of the surveys. Let's see the map. Next. The treaty, which was signed by the U.S. and Mexican representatives in a suburb of Mexico City in early 1884, outlined the new boundary, which would go all the way from the Gulf of Mexico for 2,000 miles and ending up on the coast just south of San Diego. And the treaty document said that the line would go up the main course of the Rio Grande River, about 1,200 miles, to just above the town of El Paso del Norte. In fact, the map showed it 8 miles above that town, and then head west out across the south line of New Mexico Territory to the west line of New Mexico Territory, and then up to the Gila River, then down the Gila all the way to its junction with the mighty Colorado, and then in a straight line from that junction down to the coast 3 miles south of San Diego. So the survey, they agreed then that they would, each country, the U.S. and Mexico, would set up their own boundary commission with their own surveyors, that each country would make its own set of maps, and that there would be a final set of strip maps going all the way from the coast to the coast. And as it turned out, that turned out to be 54 maps. And those maps were meant to be an integral part of the boundary survey. and we're expected to be, you know, the definitive document that actually showed where the boundary was. But today, those maps have never been published, and they exist only in our National Archives, covered with varnish and have a nice brown patina now. And I hired a guy to go down there and take photographs of the 8 maps, which we're going to talk in more detail about, because I figured out that the only way I was going to understand what these guys really did was to compare their field maps with reality in the modern maps and the satellite views, which is what my key thought in getting this whole thing started. So, from their meeting to sign the treaty in 1848, they agreed they would meet in San Diego to start the survey within a year. Well, that turned out to be too optimistic. It took them a year and a half to get their act together, and it was only the late summer of '49 when the 2 commissions gathered at San Diego to start the survey. They quickly agreed on the right spot to put the monument down on the Pacific, and then moved over to the junction of the Gila and the Rio Grande, and the Colorado, here, and put up this second monument, and then started working on surveying the straight line between the 2. They're pretty slow and had trouble, frankly, in getting the financial support that they needed from both the Mexican government and the U.S. government, and so they didn't get a whole lot done. And by the end of '49, they jointly agreed to suspend operations on the West Coast and move over to El Paso del Norte and restart the survey from there. So, in the meantime, in that lapse, a new boundary commissioner was nominated by the new president. He didn't like using the old commissioner that President Polk had nominated, so he got his own man in there. And they all then finally met again, stretching the date, and they only arrived in the El Paso area in December of 1850 now. So once they were there, they began operations by determining the longitude and latitude of the key reference town of El Paso. And lo and behold, they found that the cartoon map that they had used attached to the original treaty was way off. In fact, El Paso, if you use the grid on that map, which was just part of an atlas series published in New York, it showed that the El Paso was way over here, 125 miles to the east and 30 miles to the north of the actual position of El Paso. Well, this threw a monkey wrench into the operation immediately, and the 2 commissioners, the Garcia Conde, the Mexican commissioner, who was an experienced and surveyor, and the political nominee that the U.S. had appointed, John Russell Bartlett, got their heads together, and the Mexican commissioner out-traded the U.S. commissioner, and And somehow I got him, he yielded to moving in survey, 120 miles west to the river, which obviously had to do, either the river was a boundary or not. And then, but he also agreed to let the Mexican commissioner move that south line of territory of New Mexico up 30 miles. So you had this, what really didn't make any sense for the north boundary. But they both signed the agreement, and the U.S. surveyors immediately objected. They couldn't make any sense out of that. And the resulting hassle starting then lasted for over a year and really shut down the survey for a year and a half. And so in the meantime, the new boundary commissioner for the U.S. got tired of the sites around El Paso and moved up to the copper mines up in this area. But then the delays continued with the hassling because they didn't know where to start. And so he got bored, and he was really not interested in surveying at all anyway. He was interested in traveling in the far west. So he went on a 4,000-mile jaunt lasting over a year and a half, went from the mines here all the way down the Mazatlan, clear off the map here, then up, caught another boat, went up to San Diego, talked to only one surveyor had reached that point when he ran out of money trying to survey down the river from there, and went on. Then he went on up to San Francisco Bay, and then Napa Valley, and back down to San Francisco Bay, and then across country to El Paso. So he was entirely away from all of his surveying people for over a year and a half, and they didn't even know where he was. Because of this crazy delay, then later in 1850, late in the year, the U.S. Ambassador directed Major Emory to go out and see if he couldn't get this survey started. And so Emory went on out to this point, and we'll start from there because our interest will be only in this part of the river that's south of El Paso. Let's look at the next map. So we're going to look now more closely at the surveys south of El Paso. Next. Oops. Need to go back. There we go. Yeah, so we're going to look more closely now. Here's the area we're really interested in. El Paso in the north, and Eagle Pass or in Fort Duncan here in the south. All of our interest will be in between these points. And we are, of course, particularly interested in the book that I've written. Speaks entirely about the section from Presidio down to the mouth of the Pecos here. And in this section of the river, Presidio to the Pecos, the Mexican surveyors actually only mapped this 25-mile section right around floodplains near Presidio. And all the rest of the maps were done only by the U.S., and the Mexicans copied those maps. Their map here in just south of Presidio is an excellent map based on triangulation surveying, which is more accurate, and exceeded in quality and detail along the riverbank and everything. So better map. But then they just copied the other maps all the way down. Next. I know you'd like to see who the characters are, and here they are. Next. We start with Major Emery here on the left. He's really the heart and soul of the boundary for the 8 years of its existence. He was in from the beginning, and technical role in the beginning, but as it was clear to everyone that this guy could get the stuff done, in the end he took over all the field operations. Next is John Russell Bartlett. He's the American Boundary Commissioner during 1850 to 1852, during the main period in which the specific surveys we looked at were done. And unfortunately, his guidance was wanting because he knew nothing about surveying and really wasn't interested in it. Third guy here is the head of the Chandler Survey, which is the main survey we looked at, is Marine T.W. Chandler. Undoubtedly, his guys call him Chandler or MT or something. He's a civilian surveyor, experienced surveyor, good surveyor, but was hired by Bartlett because his father was a Whig congressman from Pennsylvania. But it turned out to be a good choice. Next is Charles Christopher Perry, a medical doctor who really had no interest in doctoring, but his life interests were botany, particularly flowers. And he was the naturalist assigned, and the doctor assigned to the Chandler expedition. Also assigned to the Chandler expedition was Duff Green here, a lieutenant, West Pointer, that led the Army escort that escorted the Chandler party through the wild Indian country, where Comanche raiders were coming down all the time. And finally here, Lieutenant Nathaniel Mitchler, he picked up the survey which Chandler party had to abandon when they got into the lower canyons. They just couldn't handle them. So he picked up where Chandler left off and carried it down to the Pecos. Next. Next. These are the 5 boundary maps of the 54 maps that I talked about earlier, the ones that I got photocopies of the archives so I could compare them. And his maps cover, of course, from Presidio, even though a little bit of his survey was overlapped here with one of earlier survey by von Hippel, who had surveyed down from El Paso. Went through the Big Bend country and up to the north, and got bogged down in the lower canyons here, and ended up camping for the last time at Hot Springs Canyon. Looking at just briefly at each map, the map here near Presidio is really an excellent map. They had plenty of time to survey along the river here because it's mainly floodplains, so they could walk right along the river and use their method of traverse lines, where they just draw straight lines along the segments of the river with their theodolite and measured distance with a chain. So they're accurate maps. And then the canyon started about in here. And from that point, Chandler would have to the Chandler party would have to go in their boats. Now, the Chandler party itself was about 70 people. We found no record of any of their members of their party, but we could piece together what it was from the detailed day-by-day accounts that we got from the daily reports of our botanist. And they had about 20 surveying, or members of the surveying team. Probably less than half of those were real surveyors. The rest of them were helpers, like carrying chain and instruments. And then they had 20 soldiers that were part of the escort to protect Chandler party. And then they had a mule train of about 30 herders, helpers, packers that would carry all the supplies and both food and shelter for Chandler party. They knew in advance that the mule train could not make it through these upper canyons, and so their plan was for the mule train to detour around and go the canyons and come into San Carlos here in the south, and then over to the Comanche crossing at Ojitos. And then in the meantime, Chandler and his party in 4 boats, 2 rubber boats, would you believe, inflatable rubber boats, and 2 wooden boats carrying their supplies. And they started out here in August of '52, where they went down into the first canyons, and the mule train started its route detour. Only 6 miles into the canyon, they hit the Rancherita Rapids and capsized both the big wooden boats with all their stuff in it. All they had left was the 2 rubber boats. And they called it Camp Destruction. And so that was here at the head of Colorado Canyon. My son and I dumped our canoe right there at the same spot a few years later. Okay. So once they lost all those boats, they had to really bomb down to the rendezvous point because we didn't have anything to eat and no tents to sleep in. So they went down to there. They got there a few days earlier. Later, then, when the mule train finally arrived with our supplies, well, they realized they had to send part of the mule train back to the start and get some additional supplies of stuff they had actually lost that they couldn't afford to lose. So they waited there, and while they waited there, about 50 Comanches on their usual raid into Mexico came to the crossing. And there was a little panic in the beginning, but then he lined up his 20 soldiers and ended up in a powwow, and they let the Comanches keep going on down into their usual route. Then Chandler group went down to the mouth of Santa Elena Canyon. They studied the canyon rapids from above for a couple of days and decided they couldn't make it. They're going to have to detour the canyon. So the mule train and the surveyors detoured over to Santa Carlos, and then came back down the river and then back up to join the river down below and restart their survey. And they could do this because they made a triangulation fix of the exit of the Santa Elena Canyon by climbing up to the top of the escarpment there and shooting Emery Peak to the east. Then I made an excellent survey then on map 20 of all the good access area across this part of the Rio Grande down to the start of Mariscal Canyon. And they knew they had a detour route around Mariscal because they had a map with them that showed this detour route that comes back to the canyon at the exit of the canyon. So they fixed the entrance and the exit of the canyon with triangulation, so they had a good fix on that, and then just rushed through with their boats and sketched the map in between. So their map is rather a cartoon in this section. Then once again, they had good access along the river all the way up to the Boquillas Canyon, and they had plenty of time to make a map here while they were searching for some detour that would take them around this huge mountain front of the Sierra de Corman. They finally found a route which was to the north, but a 2-day route that carried them all the way up into this area, then back across, and then back down to the exit of the canyon. The whole canyon's only like 17 miles, but it took them, the mule train, 2 days, and it took the canoe, the rubber boat guys, 3 days. And what they did, we don't know, because they should have been able to go 17 miles with no rapids in less than a day. They were able to then fix their position pretty well by taking shots back to the Pico Cerdo shot tower, which they could see from this exit of the canyon, and then began mapping down the river further. They ended up then crossing the river, Chandler's party, at La Linda, where the Pennypacker not Pennypacker, the bridge there at La Linda, I forget the name of it, Gerstocker Bear. He's a chairman of the Dow Chemical. So they crossed there, went down the river to the head of Temple Canyon here, and met with the surveyors there and camped there, and then the surveyors set out to map below the Temple Canyon, and the mule train then tried to find a blind detour. They didn't have time to scout a detour, so they just had to try to find one blindly, which they did with actually no success, because they camped with the surveyors here, then ended up going further and further away from the river, looking for a route back to the river, and finally found this trail and went down that trail to the Hot Springs camp. But now they were like 4 or 5 times as far down the river as they had wanted to be, and the surveyors were marooned, left to drift without food and shelter in those canyons below. At that point, they had to realize that there was no way with their mode of operation, which was they couldn't carry enough equipment and food in the small rubber boats, so they had to have the support of the mule train every night, and they couldn't do that. So they finally decided they had to cancel the survey, and they camped here at Hot Springs Rapid and began a 300-mile trek down and over to Fort Duncan at Eagle Pass. Next. How we doing? Okay, we're out of time. So let's skip this one. Let's keep going. Next, keep going. We're going to skip that illustration. I was going to show you a side-by-side of the Chandler's map and a modern map. I did this on all the maps that we looked at in this section of Presidio to the Pecos River. Next. Next. Oops. There you go. Yeah, so what happened when Chandler abandoned the survey, his final camp is indicated here. In the summer of '53 now, Major Emily directed Mitchler to go to the spot where Chandler stopped and fill in the survey down to the mouth of the Pecos here. Now, the problem was nobody, neither Mitchler, Chandler, or Emery knew where Chandler's final camp was, because all he had at that point was a bunch of notes on his way to Washington to make a map. But they guessed that he was in this area somewhere. So Mitchler in San Antonio got in 3 wagons, built himself 3 wood boats, which he disassembled, put in the boats. He had a small party, maybe 30 people, 10 surveyors, all the rest support people. And they went up the river, along the Devil's River, on the stage road, all the way up to Pecos Springs, which is clear up here, and then over west to a spring they call King Spring, and then tried to go southwest because Mitchler thought they still needed to go southwest to meet the point of Chandler's last point. But there were no trails going that way. All the trails were going down into the drainage of Independence Creek. So ended up following those trails down Independence Creek and ended up leaving Independence Creek, which is up in this area, over to Meyer Spring, all the time following the Indian trails, before he finally found a trail that went down to the river that he could use with his wagon. So they did that, and they ended up here at a crossing, which Mitchler called Liapon Crossing because the Indians frequented there. And then from that base camp, they surveyed on land using theodolite and the chain again up to the mouth of San Francisco Canyon. And there they were stopped cold by the huge canyon, and they looked on up the river from there, and they saw the canyons getting increasingly deep. So they stopped surveying up the river. But in the final report, Mitchler never admitted that he didn't reach Chandler's Point. He implied that he did, but in fact, no one saw this section of river. I say no one. Well, no one except a boatman named Charles Abbott, who, when Chandler left his final camp and walked out, Abbott and a couple of his buddies got in the best rubber boat and floated all the way down to Fort Duncan in 10 days. The first crossing of the lower canyons by a boat that's documented. Okay, next. I know we're beyond the limit here. So I enjoyed working on this. I worked on it for several years, but I really found it very rewarding and interesting project. I hope you got a little bit of the excitement that I felt in working on it. Thank you.
Okay, next up is Scooter Cheatham, who I have worked with since the late 1970s. He is, depending on who is doing the describing, he has been called a Renaissance man, a jack of all trades, and a polypyrophoromaniac, which is a person with too many irons in the fire. And better than me talking, we are going to show a short film that a filmmaker in Austin did that will tell you a lot more about what we're doing, and then Scooter will speak.
You can meditate all you want, but 30 minutes on river bottom creates a transcendence that's unlike anything else. It seems like there's a vast intelligence there that is beyond us. There's even a sense almost of an unnameable music. Both my paternal grandparents had places in the country. My dad did. My grandparents and dad all had professional lives, but they also retained somewhat from the Great Depression, rural lifestyles. We had horses and cows, and I had to milk cows when I was growing up, gardening and all those things. So I had a lot of time to cavort around in the wild. We thought of the country and the wild environment, and I guess you could say the plants. We just thought of that as a place where the animals went. And so if you wanted to go hunting, you had to go to the country and to the wild part of the country to see game. We didn't think of the plants much more than you would as a place to go hunt animals. And that's the mindset I grew up in. When I was in college at UT, I took a class in anthropology, and during the course, another friend and I ended up doing an experimental archaeology project on my grandmother's property on the Guadalupe River. In a 10-day period, all we collected was a possum and an armadillo. And so we had lots of time to sit around and go, wow, how did these people do? How did they make do? The idea of everything the plant kingdom contributes to humans never became more clear than it did on that trip. So what if this is the way it was? We really didn't have a place to go back to. What if for some reason everything went wrong and we didn't have civilization again? How would we start over? And nobody wants the answer, but the answer is everything comes from the plant kingdom. We couldn't recreate society, recreate culture without all the diversity of the plant kingdom. Botanists have come up with the term plant blindness, and it applies to people who don't live in a subsistence lifestyle in a first world country because we're cut off from plants. If you come from a subsistence background where everything you have comes from the plants that are around you, all of your medicines, your foods, your commodities, your fibers, everything you make, your clothes, you don't lose the awareness and the significance of how the plant kingdom supports everything you do. But as soon as you're into a first world situation, you don't know anything about that and don't need to.
Okay, DALL.
The mission of Use for Wild Plants is to explore all those untapped uses, to advance research through science and all those uses, and advocate conservation of all those plants so we'll have them available to our great-grandchildren. So we threw this net that we wanted to study all of the uses of every species, species-based, from prehistoric to present in the most recent study in phytochemistry and all the medical science. As far as I know, no other organization on the planet is doing this comprehensive study species by species. We feel like that's the only way to sort of set up the next level of research. It's taken us a long time to get the photography for it and to accumulate the vast amount of research to put these volumes out. Completing that research, and it's going to take some significant funding. We need to be able to hire 15 writers to get it done in our lifetime. Ultimately, it's a means to an end. The information base is the first phase of the project, and then we thought of how the project interfaces with the rest of society. Education, K through 12, and college. In terms of land, selling conservation by pointing out the value of plants on people's property that they should save and not bulldoze, and deep research, then product development, marketing those products. Our research is the gateway. We have now many advanced forms of exploration of plants, studying their chemistry, the medical effects, pharmacognosy, and molecular biology, which we're in a position now that we've never been in before. We're on the brink of a huge change in plant science, and that is we're in a position now to accelerate crop development. We can single out properties of a plant that we think are important. It's going to help human beings. We can create a way to generate a lot of that compound. There's some multi-million-dollar investments that can pay off. Going forward, it's going to be a major source of money, as I call it, the last economy on planet Earth. People have a great fascination with going to Mars. The truth of the matter is we have a whole new planet under our feet we haven't even looked at yet. And the truth is the smallest vascular plant may end up being more valuable than anything we ever find on Mars. I think an awful lot of conservationists want us to pity nature, but that's not the problem. We need to pity ourselves because we're the ones that are going to lose in the long run. They say you can't see the forest for the trees. Well, our problem is we can't see the trees for the forest. People look out at the wild environment and are unconcerned about plant species. And I think if people can wake up to the importance of plants, the world is going to be a lot better place, and we'll all be able to stay here. And if we don't, we're not going to be able to stay here. I mean, it's that simple.
Okay, can y'all hear me okay in the back? If you can, I'm not going to put on that microphone. I don't think it really helps that much. Can y'all hear me?
You need to have the mic on.
What?
For the people online. People online need to hear you.
Oh, online. Okay, I got it. For all the Zoomers. Okay. This film is very recent, and we've just had it a few days. And our friend Steve Mims, who put it together, called the office the other day, and Lynn answered the phone, and she was saying how much she enjoyed it. She thought it was great. And I said, from a distance, the only problem with the film is I really don't like that old actor you picked to play my part. so then Lynn handed me the phone, and I had to explain it to Steve, and he said, I did the best I could. So, anyway, I've got a PowerPoint that has about over 160 slides in it to go into depth about the project. We're kind of running short of time, so I'm wondering if it wouldn't be better for me to elaborate a little bit on some of the things brought up in the film and not worry you down with too much detail. The PowerPoint with the voiceover will be on our new website, which just went up last night, after a while. That won't be up immediately, but the film is on there and some other things that Lynn will tell you about. One of the things I want to talk about a little bit is plant blindness. And what I found, discussed there in that situation, is I woke up to plant blindness by stress, by not having anything much to eat for over a week. And so when Glenn Good and I did this trip, we spent a lot of time around the fire going, well, as I said there, how would you start over if we couldn't go back? And if you think about that enough, it's hard to do that here because everything is manufactured and it's in place and whatnot. But if you think for just a minute, can you find one thing in this room did not come from the plant kingdom? Even the glass had to be melted by an organic source, right? The chairs and the podium and the steps, those are all obvious, but the cloth, everything comes from the plant kingdom. Even if it's plastic, it's old plant juice, non-renewable. And so it hit me, and Glenn went on and became an archaeologist, and I was just finishing up an architecture school, but it hit me that we were going to be in a situation at some time in the future where we were not going to have non-renewables. We're going to have to go back to the plant kingdom. And so I went and met Marshall Johnston, who had just finished the Manual of Vascular Plants of Texas with Don Carell. Does anybody know that? Does anybody here have the Manual of Vascular Plants? It's the Bible of Texas plants. But very little is said about plant uses. And so I explained to Marshall the trip I'd just done and the revelation that I'd had and sort of wake-up call. And encouraged him to take that on as his next project. And he said, no, that's something for a younger person. And Marshall, I think, was only 40 then, and I was 26. So anyway, we sort of knocked it back and forth, and then we talked about how Texas is the intersection of 11 botanical zones. And if we did a pilot project on Texas, then we would be affecting almost all of North America. because there are a lot of plants from Mexico and Texas, even all the way to British Columbia, Newfoundland, Canada. So we launched this concept, and at the time I was in architecture school. Interdisciplinary research was a very important new idea, and if it's new to you, just to give a little bit of explanation. Interdisciplinary is distinguished from multidisciplinary by setting up a situation where different scientists work together in the same space and share ideas. And most of the sciences, especially the plant sciences, even more now than then, are doing what our molecular biologists call siloing. You heard that term? Siloing means you focus yourself on just one thing and you sort of get in a rut. And our vice president is a molecular biologist, Stan Rue, and Lynn has copies of our latest update, and Stan tells why he's a supportive member, a board member of Useful Wild Plants, EarthFit. But Stan is one of those people that focuses only on Arabidopsis thaliana, one plant, because it has a short life cycle. But when Stan brings his class out to our office, every year, sometimes twice a year, we take them to a weed lot out behind the office, and Stan doesn't know any plants. He buys tissue, so he only studies tissue. And so what's happened in the plant sciences world in academia is that there is a lot of support for molecular research. There's no support for taxonomy, and there's very little support for phytochemistry. And phytochemistry is what's going to tell us all the hundreds of thousands of other compounds our 400,000 species have. And if you multiply, let's say 500,000 by 400,000, that's a pretty large number of compounds we don't even know about yet. And as I said on the film, we're very excited about going to Mars, but right under our feet, not here, but out there, is a whole new planet that we haven't even touched, and we're not even thinking about it, because we get, when you go to Central Market, there are even more choices of potatoes and apples than there have ever been. Why should we worry, right? But they're all coming from other places, right? And so we're drawing that down. What? Oh, it's up. Okay. I must have punched it.
And yes, it's randomly showing things.
Oh, I have 10 minutes? Okay. So one of our goals now, we're a different part of the project where we're creating the information base, which we call the Stargate, to a green future. We're at a point where we need to get the word out. And when we spend time working on the volumes and doing the photography, we have no social life. We 24/7. If any of you are writers, you'll know what I mean. You have to cut off all contact. You can't interact with anybody. But we're at a point now, we think, because of our world circumstances and the recent pipeline issue, the pandemic, the big freeze, are kind of reminders that we need to be aware of basics. But we're at a point where I'm giving this talk because we're at that point. And we need to let people know about the project, and I hope some of you will do the same thing. We're also at a point where we're trying to organize our plant scientists to interact and build a team. So far, what we've been doing with our plant scientists is we take their material and we do the interdisciplinary explanation, but we want them to begin to do that and to work together. The other thing we're doing is we are taking the project to children, because we think a lot of the people of our generation are too stuck in their ways maybe to see what we're talking about. So we're spending a lot of time doing that. And I'm going to give you an example of how quickly plant blindness can wipe out oral tradition. Our next door neighbor at our office was a guy named Sonny Ogunro. And Sonny Ogunro, about 53 years ago, something like that?
What?
grew up in Ise, Nigeria, which is a village. He hunted lions with a spear with his grandfather. He lived in a village where everybody knew what the plants were. They knew that their medicines, their food, their fibers, everything came from those plants. And so when they got up in the morning and looked around, they didn't see a bunch of chairs and walls and paintings. They saw something that looked like that out there. Okay. And so if you know that those things are going to contribute to your well-being, you're a lot more careful with them. You're a much better steward. And we've reached a point now where we sort of go from our cars to places like this, to the grocery store, and we just, plants, we call it the term plant blindness has been used, we call it the green cloak of invisibility, which is, you know, we're borrowing it from J.K. Rowling. But so some of the things that you can do, if you're interested in this idea, is participate more with the Witte. They've got great gardens. They've got a plant program. Organize among yourselves. You know, there's native plant societies everywhere, but there's not an organization right now like EarthFit where everybody comes together to invest in the uses of plants. Most of our friends in native landscape programs are trading plants, but they're not doing the deep research. And we have a lot of ideas about how that can carry forward. But I want to leave more time for questions. Does anybody? Yeah.
Yeah, I was hoping to get some actual names or information on some of these wild plants.
Get a volume, Lynn.
Without having to go to a book.
Well, okay.
I can
The
do
problem
that.
is, I don't think, how much more time do we have?
We've got about 6 minutes.
6 minutes?
Do you have anything on the top of your head? 2 or 3
Well,
plants?
there are lots of things, but they're in the PowerPoint.
No palitos.
What's that?
No palitos.
Nopalitos?
No pal.
Yeah. Well, there's some right out out in front of the museum. They're delicious. Yeah, go ahead.
We're here for lunch. Yeah.
Do you have a list online?
A little louder?
We can have every day.
Online of any of that information?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Do you have a list online of any of that information that you can?
Yeah. The PowerPoint's going to be online in a couple of weeks.
But the information about the plants actually runs for hundreds and hundreds of pages, so that's available in books. Eventually, we will have availability in other formats, but our job right now is to get the information base completed, and we're putting books out sequentially, but this is the most detailed thing that's ever been done, and I do have copies of the books, our travel copies, they're not sales copies. And I can give you one of our newsletters also, which doesn't talk about the specific plants in this. That's just too great of.
I would have just been interested in seeing the slideshow, but I know he doesn't have time. But
Yeah, it's a long slideshow. You can flip over to some of the plants.
Okay. What, you have just like 6 minutes? 5 minutes. Okay. Well, I'll run some things in. Let me just run past what's going on here. That's the information base. This is not moving very fast. Encyclopedia. Each volume has its own end papers, its own species. This is Berber swayzii, endemic to the hill country. For people that want to know more about the plants, I want to get past this pretty quick. 350,000 slides. And I already said something about the status of the project. We're in a marketing phase right now. Let me go back one. We have a set of program areas. Our program areas are land, commerce, and research and education. And we participate heavily. We believe that conservation is a major issue right now. But we feel like people have to know why the plants are important. Y'all have a better clicker? This one's just not working. It's just not doing anything. What?
Really press it.
Okay, all right. Okay, under the category of conservation, we have threatened species, threatened habitats, but we also think genetic diversity is very important. Yeah, go. What? Point back there? Okay, yeah, in pitcher plant bogs in East Texas, the longleaf pines are crowding them out, so we're losing rare species in the pitcher plant bogs. Okay, this is, well, this is not working for me. All right. Okay, under genetic diversity, most of the things that you see at the grocery store come from something that looked like this, a roughshod habitat like this. As an example, well, all right, this is an example. All of the things that you see here in the produce have wild genetic counterparts in Texas. And they all came from something that looked like that scruffy lot I showed you first. I'm trying to go backwards. Okay. As an example, at Olmeda Refuge in South Texas, we have the original tomato, Lycopersicon esculentum. I'm sorry. We have many species of wild onion. We have a lot of species of tomatillo, and some of which are much tastier than the ones that you get at the supermarket. And that's going back this way. In the mountains of West Texas, that was Mount Livermore, we have wild potato, Solanum findleri. We have wild beans in West Texas on Sul Ross Hill. And Mustang grape, the commonest grape in Texas. We have many species of grape. That's a wild strawberry in East Texas. That's Frigeria virginiana. And we have a Frigeria bracteata in the mountains of West Texas, so we have it in both kinds of environment. Zania texensis, that's endemic and rare Texas wild rice. Okay, all right. Okay, I hope everybody got a little bit of something they wanted. Okay, Lynn?
Okay, we just uploaded, okay. We have worked with two groups of students.
Take your mask off.
We've worked with, sorry. We've worked with two groups of students recently from the Macomb School of Business at UT to do two parts of the website, and we just got a lot of it up last night. We will have two domains that point to the same website. One will be usefulwildplants.org, which is what's listed. The other one is earthfit.org. And right now, only the EarthFit is pointing properly. We need to do some domain name switching.
But just
right
give
now.
them the exact.
Yeah, I did. Usefulwildplants.org and earthfit.org.
But right now, only earthfit.org.
Yeah.
If you want to look at it today, and you'll laugh at some things. It's still moving some things around.
Feel free to email us with any errors you find.
Show them the volume.
Okay, there's your.
And we've got our most recent update for everybody here. Complimentary copy. And how do you want to do the questions? You want to for us to just?
They're time.
Oh, questions are gone. Hurry.
But I'll be like the girl in the boxing ring. Here's a copy of the book. Very quickly, lots of words, lots of margin notes so you can get to what you need, lots of pictures, maps, and common names, and everything you can figure out to know about it, it's in here.
By the way, thank y'all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.